time we met, we were talking about pre-Columbian Native American societies. My question for you to review with us, what stood out in your mind when it comes to the differences between North America and what we were talking about with Mesoamerica? Oh, sorry? The way that they parceled out power, is that what you mean? How was it different in North America versus Central America? All right, who's talking now? Yes. North America parceled it out much more evenly. In that way, they were more democratic. If that's not your notes, it needs to be. Right? Now, why were they more democratic? Say it again. Well, there are more groups, yeah, and they have to learn how to live with one another. In other words, there's not one central empire that's just governing everybody. Very good, right? It's a much tougher climate to make a living, okay? So if you need all hands on deck, you can't just tell somebody jump and everybody's going to say how high. You need to give them some ability to make some impact in their day-to-day life. Some discretion, some autonomy in their day-to-day life, right? So to do that, you need to parcel out the power. Now, probably even more importantly, how did they do this? Do you have a specific group? Do you have a specific document in mind when it comes to how power was parceled out more evenly? Very good. In the case of the Pueblos, remember the Pueblos, the Southwest? In the winter, there was one moiety that was in charge, group of people that governed. And then what happened in the summer? They changed. Leaders changed. It was a bloodless transfer of power. Right? You would not have seen that in ancient Rome. Probably would not have seen that in ancient Aztec. It was one ruler for the whole year, or in this case, the whole decade. Right? So the Pueblo people are a good example of an early form of democracy. Another example. Yeah?
Seasonal economies.
All right, seasonal economy, so there's a lot more economic diversity, so to speak. Right? What else? Think about democracy. Who's in upstate New York? Remember those guys? Somebody said it. The Algonquian and the Iroquois, right? And the upper Great Lakes region, that's the governing tribe, or not tribe, but nation. They speak that similar language. And before the emergence of the Iroquois League, they were continuously at war with one another. So what did the Iroquois League do? If you were with us last week, it was an early form of democracy. But what did the Iroquois League guarantee everybody living in that part of the country, that part of the continent? Is anybody familiar with the United Nations, the UN? Right? When the UN meets, the United States, Britain, Russia, France, China, we meet as co-equals. In other words, China doesn't get to ram something down everyone else's throats. It gets to say its ideas the same way that any other co-equal country would. That was the Iroquois League. Think about this in terms of the U.S. Senate. We're a big state, Texas, geographically and population-wise. But how many senators do we get in Congress? 2. Wyoming is a tiny little state when it comes to population. But how many senators do they get? And everybody has an equal opportunity to make their voice heard, right? To make laws, to throw their 2 cents into the pot, right? So that's an example of the Iroquois League. Wyandotte Constitution, another example of early Native American small d democracy, democratic process, okay? Questions? All right, we need, yeah, question.
I kind of want to go more into the
Cahokia?
Yeah.
For your notes, Cahokia is the largest urban area in North America before Europeans made contact. That's Cahokia. And it's also a trading epicenter, right? You've got all this wealth from every corner of the North American continent. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get what I'm saying. And it's all pouring into Cahokia, right? So that is what I need you to understand about Cahokia. Yeah? the Kusa chieftain, right? That is similar to Cahokia in the sense that the great mound builders, remember talking about the great mound builders? Right, that's who we're talking about in northwestern Georgia. They are, right, same people. All right, what we need to do is talk about integration of Europe and to a lesser extent Africa in the history of the Americas. Now, to do that, I need to ask you, why Europe? Over the course of about 50 to 100 years, the world became dominated by Europeans, by Spaniards, by Frenchmen, by Englishmen. How could this happen? How did it happen? And more importantly, how did it happen so quickly? Does anybody know what Europe was like before 1492? What was it like? Well, let me put it to you this way. After Rome fell, the Roman Empire, Europe entered into what historians call the Dark Ages, or for our purposes, the Middle Ages. And let me put it to you another way. This is a time period in European history where pretty much everything was bad, right? A lot of people like to make fun of this time period in European history. They call it 1,000 years where nobody in Europe took a bath, right? Europe was weak. It was backwards. And it was tough to make a living there. So it really is an important question. Why was it Europe? Why was it not some other part of the world, some other great civilization that became the dominant power? Right? We'll find out part of that question here in just a few minutes. But what I'd like you to understand is nobody really leaves their homeland unless there's a necessity to it. Right? Europe's population is growing, but generally speaking, there's not enough to go around, so they're looking elsewhere for the things that they can't procure in Europe. Now, what really adds fuel to this fire begins in the 1260s, a long, long time ago, and it really begins to accelerate through a guy from Venice, Italy, known as Marco Polo. Right now, outside of the funnest summertime game in American history, who was Marco Polo? Kind of. Yeah, obviously maps come after Marco Polo. But what did he do in, let's say, 1272, for instance? He went on vacation. He went to the east. Right now, he's doing so primarily by land. But here's Venice, Italy, over here in the central part of Europe, and he's going through what we would call Greece, right, parts of the Mediterranean Sea, the Arab world, the Middle Eastern world, the Persian Gulf over here, North Asia, down through what is now India, South Asia, through the South Asian Sea, and finally over here to the Far East, what we call China, right? Now, just that he went on vacation was important enough alone, but what did he come back with? What? Yes, inventions like what? Huh? Some of the things that he came back with were spices. What Europeans are eating right now, we would call rotting food. Not very good. So if you can think about ways of drowning out that terrible taste, throw a little pepper on it, throw a little spice on it, it's going to dress up the taste. You'd be willing to pay a lot of money for that, right? So he's bringing back stuff that Europeans want to buy. And if you want to buy this stuff, you've got to go through the Italians. You've got to go through the Venetians, right? He's bringing back silk. What do they wear in Europe for the most part during this period? Do you know? Heavy wool, right? If you've ever worn a wool sweater, like Christmas time, right? It picks at your skin, it's itchy, it does not breathe. I mean, it's heavy. Makes it for really good in Bemidji, Minnesota, not so good in Dallas, Texas, right? So if you can bring back a material that you can use as clothing, and it breathes, it's light on your skin, and it allows for the flow of air, it's going to sell very well. So silk was something that he brought back, right? But what really sold well, gunpowder, right? Marco Polo brings back all these cool things that Europeans are going to spend money hand over fist for, right? Now, what I need you to understand here is when this stuff starts coming back, it's going back to Venice, Italy, right? And so the Italians are going to have a monopoly on the Eastern Asian market. You want this stuff, you got to spend big bucks through the Italians. What happens if you're, you know, of the Spanish variety, if you're Portuguese, if you're English? What do you have to do? What choices do you have? Well, you either have to fork over the money, or you can find an alternative route from Europe to the East, right? Enter into the conversation the time period that I like to think of as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle time period of European history, the Renaissance. Now, you've got Leonardo, you got Donatello, you got Raphael, and who am I doing? That's right, Michelangelo. So all of these famous, legendary European artists, they're all a part of the Renaissance. That's a $10 French word that means what? What does Renaissance mean? Rebirth. Rebirth, right? Particularly the rebirth of art. I like to think of it as the rebirth of thinking, the rebirth of knowledge, okay? When Rome fell, people were primarily concerned with just making it through their day. You don't have a Roman army out there policing the streets. You don't have a Roman army out there enforcing the laws. So what went away was literacy, knowledge of the human anatomy, knowledge of the world, of the solar system, and Europe was really in a dark age for about 1,000 years. It's beginning to end around about this time period. People are reading again, they're studying again, and even though you might not think about it, one of the things that they're beginning to study are maps, geography, okay? Let's talk about a guy from Portugal named Prince Henry. Right? He's a term up there, Prince Henry of Portugal. Throughout most of the medieval period, right, Europe suffered from continuous invasions from North Africa, right? Africa imposed its will on Europe, not the other way around. And that changed, at least for the Portuguese variety, through Prince Henry. Now, not only does Prince Henry put a stop to these African invaders, he actually pushes them back into what is now North Africa, Algeria, where he set up, write it down, a naval observatory, right? He is setting up a center where people can do nothing but study maps day and night. And he's sending his Portuguese sea captains, his sailors there. And he's having them sit down with Arab traders who knew that part of the world like the back of their hand. In other words, he's beginning to study maps of Africa. Why Africa? Can you see where he's going? Maybe resources, but maybe also an alternative route to Asia, right? The Portuguese, if you look at my map up here, the Italians have this locked up. And so if you're Portuguese, if you exist right here, it's not as if you can take a shortcut through the Mediterranean Sea to get to the east. You can't do it. They've got a lockout. So you need to go around Africa. In order to do that, you need effective maps. And those were hard to come by before Prince Henry of Portugal. So what they're doing, the Portuguese Navy, little by little, they're inching their way around the African continent, but eventually they sail around what is today South Africa, up into the Arab world. They're bringing all this cool stuff back, up through the Indian world, and eventually over to the east. What you need to write down next to Prince Henry, he found an alternative route from Western Europe to the east. And in the process, Portugal became a very rich and consequently very powerful European country. It got rich, it got powerful because it's trading with the East. And if you can do that, you can become a rich and powerful European country. So everybody wants to follow the lead of Prince Henry. Now, for your notes, what Prince Henry's doing is he's laying out a blueprint, right? This is how you become a rich and powerful European country. That's his significance and his importance, okay? Do you have any questions? Yeah? Observatory, right? Just a center where they can study maps. Yeah?
Set up an alternative route from Western where?
from Western Europe to Asia, right? He wants to get to the East. Now, what Prince Henry does is not just trade with those Asian societies, he's also trading with African societies and kingdoms too. Western Africa in particular. What's in West Africa that Europeans might want? Gold. I heard somebody said gold. Yes, you're right. What else?
Didn't they got the sugar there now?
You got the right idea, but the wrong commodity. Right? Salt is an important one, but I was thinking ivory. Right? Ivory is a precious material. Europeans love it, can't get enough of it. Africa's got it, so the Europeans are trading with these African kingdoms. Now, you mentioned sugar. Off the distant coast of Portugal is a collection of islands known as the Cape Verde Islands. And the Portuguese have colonized these. And what grows really well in the Verde Islands? Sugar, right? And sugar will revolutionize the European diet. It's going to make European countries a whole lot of money. There's a lot of money to be made with the sugar crop. Okay? Problem is, it's not going to make any money unless you can grow it in quantities that are so vast that you can sell it wholesale. In order to do that, you need a lot of workers. You see where I'm going with this? What are Portuguese traders eventually going to want out of Africa? Slaves. They're going to want forced laborers. Now let's talk about slavery in Africa. And what I'd like you to understand, slavery existed in Africa a long time before Europeans showed up. Right? But it was a very different form of slavery. Right? If you had gone into debt, you couldn't pay your bills, a lot of times you could voluntarily go into a state of servitude. You would have to work under somebody, but not only was there a light at the end of the tunnel, you could eventually get your freedom, you did not pass your condition as a slave on to your children. Why is Frederick Douglass a slave? His mother was a slave. Very good, guys. The condition of the mother, as it relates to American slavery, determines the condition of the child. So it's generation. Okay? Not the case in African context of slavery. Okay? Most of the time, the people that were slaves in Africa had simply been conquered by another people, and they were essentially prisoners of war. Right? But once again, this state of bondage was not permanent, and you did not pass it on to the next generation. What European contact is going to do is radically change the definition of African slavery. Slavery taken out of Africa and transplanted into another part of the world. Okay? Now, we've talked about what the Europeans wanted. What did the African societies that they're trading with want? They're giving them slaves, but what do they want? They want technology, including guns. The Portuguese have these magic sticks that are revolutionizing the way that human beings fight. Right? Obviously, you can see why these societies would want them. But in order to keep that trade going with the Europeans, if you're an African kingdom, where do you get more slaves? Because that's what they want. Where do you go to get more slaves? Exactly. You go to other villages and you conquer them. And you enslave their peoples and you sell them to the Europeans. So what the Europeans are doing, even though they didn't necessarily have this spelled out, it wasn't exactly like a well-planned execution, they touched off a series of vicious civil wars. So by the time that the 19th century dawned, Africa had suffered through, decade after decade after decade of these vicious civil wars, and was low-hanging fruit for European colonists. They were able to carve up Africa. Okay. Do you have any questions about this? We'll come back to the institution of slavery later in the class. Now, for the time being, I want to spend some time talking about the Spanish. Now, just so you're clear on this, Spain was not the country that you think of it today. It was a collection of different empires, but they become united with the marriage of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, right? They consolidate their empires, and Spain becomes the modern-day version of what you think of when you think the country of Spain. Now, the other thing that Ferdinand and Isabella want to do is enhance the Spanish economy, right? And we've seen how you become a rich economy. You trade with the East, right? The problem is The Italians locked up the Mediterranean Sea, and the Portuguese now have a domination when it comes to the route around Africa. So once again, we're going to have to think outside the box. Enter into our conversation this Italian guy by the name of Christopher Columbus. What is his radical thought? You can do what? You can get east by going west. So traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, you could eventually get to where you want, an alternative route to Asia by sailing west. If this is possible, that's going to mean that the world has to be what shape? Round. I need you to understand something. This is not a radical thought. I mean, the Greeks understood that the world was round. As we found out the other day, the Mayans understood that the world was round. The radical thought that Christopher Columbus had was he was the only one stupid enough to try something like this. Right? Nobody was willing to risk their skin trying something like this. Well, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand said, you know what, we're going to give him a shot. They gave him 3 rickety old ships, right? They emptied the prisons of Madrid, right? And primarily his crew was made up of prisoners, right? And they said, Chris, knock yourself out. And Columbus said, I'll be back within about a week, right? I'm exaggerating, obviously, but he said it's a short distance from point A to point B. Almost a month later, his crew is dangling him over the deck of his ship because they assumed he had gotten them lost at sea. And then they spotted a bird, right? Why is that important? Where there are birds, there is land. And they land in the island nation that he called San Salvador. Now, where did he think he was? He thought he was off the coast of India. So naturally, he called the people that ran up to him with golden trinkets and other gifts. He called them Indians. There was a lot of confusion as to where he actually was. But that name stuck, right? Anyway, what he does in the aftermath of making contact is pretty much go island hopping around the Caribbean. Goes to Cuba and thinks he is up here in Japan, right? And all the while that he's making contact with island after island, he's sending stuff back to Spain. Drawings of these Indians, some of the products like tobacco that they're gifting to him, he's sending it back to the Spanish crown, right? What did Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand say? They believe him? Is he in India? They say, Chris, I don't know what kind of tobacco you're smoking over there, but you're nowhere near the East. Right? I know what Asians look like. I know what kind of products are coming out of Asia. You're nowhere near there. But we know a good thing when we see it. These are commodities that will sell very well on the European marketplace. So what the Spanish begin to do after Columbus has died is they begin to colonize the New World. They began to send more Spaniards over to take advantage of these products and extract them out of the Old World, send them over there to Europe. Okay. So let's talk about some of the Spanish conquest. Ponce de Leon. He's sniffing around Florida. What's he looking for, do you know? Anybody know? Well, yes, gold, treasure, but in particular the fountain of youth. There's this European fascination with the New World. And people like Vasquez, Nunez de Balboa, they're looking for this expressway system that was believed to exist that would connect the Americas, a hop, skip, and a jump to Asia. I mean, even as late as the early 19th century, Thomas Jefferson believed that there was this secret passageway, this Northwest Passage from the Americas, so that they could do business with China in particular. But the guy that I really need you to be mindful of is a middling Spanish military leader, a guy by the name of Hernán Cortés, right? Cortés is commissioned to lead an expedition to the Mesoamerican mainland, right? Everywhere the Spanish are going, they're hearing about these fabled cities of gold. Who are they talking about? Aztecs, right? Talking about the Aztec Empire. It's Cortés that is commissioned to lead this conquest against the Aztecs. And how many soldiers does the Spanish crown give him? About 500 Spanish conquistadors against the entire Aztec Empire, right? Advantage Aztecs in terms of numbers. But the Spanish had some advantages of their own. Like what? Weapons. They had not only guns, but steel, right? Over the course of centuries, Europeans had become very skilled metal workers, and steel was harder, more durable, sharper, and lasted longer than any kind of technology found anywhere else throughout the Americas. What else do they have in terms of weaponry? Guns, steel, horses, right? They've got horses. And this is not only going to eventually revolutionize Native American life, it's going to give the Spanish a really big advantage when it comes to fighting. Anything else in the way of advantages that the Spanish enjoyed? Like what? Yes. How many of you have had chicken pox? Right? Many of you have. How many times in your life do you generally get chicken pox? Right? And then you develop immunities and antibodies that help fight off that particular illness. In our day and age, that type of illness is more or less an inconvenience. You're off of school for 2 weeks, you got to wear the itchy calamine lotion, but outside of that, it's not that big of a deal, right? Native Americans have been cut off from the rest of the world for over 3,000 years. So for 3,000 years, they haven't seen chickenpox, or more importantly, smallpox. And when it was introduced, not only did it spread like wildfire, it drained the Americas of their population. In some instances, the population base declines upwards of 90%. This is a massive draining of the population. Okay? Historians will call this Pax Americana. I call it the Spanish silent ally. Okay? The Native Americans were basically having to fight this two-front war. Of course, they had to fight the Spanish, but they also had to do so being sick, having their society crippled by disease. Okay? Now, the last thing I'd like you to understand about the Spanish conquest. It's been pretty difficult to imagine had it not been for Native American allies. When Cortez showed up, he arrived with an interpreter, a woman by the name of Malinaldo. Now, she spoke the Aztec language, but she also spoke Spanish. And what's she telling all of these tribes that have been conquered by the Aztecs? Join us. Come join our cause. And if you join our cause, they will set you free from the oppression that the Aztecs have been having over you for the last up to 10 years. So, diseases, guns, and Native American allies helped Cortez conquer the entire empire. Okay? Now, like I said before, this initial contact with Europeans devastated Native American societies. Like I said, over 90% of specific populations were completely obliterated because this kind of illness had not been seen for the better part of 3,000 years. Question: should the Spanish be considered war criminals using biological warfare? What do you think? Who's talking? You said yes? Why so?
Well, because, I mean, I'm going to assume that means that what they had, these people couldn't fight off. So it's almost like you bring in illness that you know will weaken them so they can overrule them, they can overtake them.
Well, initially they had no idea why these natives were getting so sick and dying. But eventually, it became pretty clear, right? And eventually what the Spanish did in certain instances, not always, but in certain instances, rubbed themselves with these blankets, knowing that they would expose the natives to their germs, and then passing them out. And it would spread like wildfire, and it would kill that population. Okay? So it's a very controversial subject, the idea of celebrating Columbus Day. Right? There are some people that consider Columbus to be equivalent to like an Adolf Hitler. He exterminated a specific portion of the Earth's population. Now, you could make the case that he did so initially, inadvertently, but nonetheless. Yeah?
If he gave those smallpox to the other people, wouldn't he be, his
No, because they've been exposed. Let me give you an example. Exactly. When I was in college at Michigan State, there would be the first week of class where just about every freshman on that campus would be sick, right? A lot of the students that came to MSU came to study agriculture, so they're probably not hanging out in inner city Chicago, right? They're coming from upstate Illinois, they're coming from the rural part of Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, you get the idea. So they're not exposed to the urban populations in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Gary, Indiana, right? And when you're exposed to a bigger population, you're exposed to different illnesses. And over the course of time, you build up a tolerance to these illnesses. So it's possible to be a carrier, somebody that's bringing the disease and infecting somebody else, and not show any signs of illnesses. And that's what the Spanish were doing, right? They carried it over. They had been exposed to it, but their biological system had evolved to the point where they could fight it off, to the point where it really wasn't even noticeable, right? The Native Americans did not have that biological advantage. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Anyway, although Pax Americana resulted in what a lot of historians call a genocide, in the aftermath of the leveling off of the outbreak, you see what becomes known as the Columbian Exchange. Okay? What this is an exchange of organisms, plants and animals. It's an exchange of people. There's a lot of Spaniards and later other European ethnicities coming over. And it's also an exchange of ideas. Okay? What comes over to the Americas? Do you know? Horses, very good. The horse had gone extinct a long time before the Spanish showed up. You said cattle. It's a pretty important industry in South America, right? Cattle is introduced. Pigs are introduced, right? And they flourish. What kind of food crops? Wheat, right? Think Kansas, think Nebraska, the breadbasket of not only the United States, the world. They produce a whole lot of grain up there, right? So these old world food crops and stuffs start coming over and they flourish in the Americas. What goes from the Americas to the old world? Maize, corn, right? And what corn does is it fuels a population growth. It fuels the growing population of European society. What else? Ever been to an Irish pub? What do they like to eat? Potatoes. And not just in Ireland. The British Isles, generally speaking, all across Scandinavia, Russia, Germany, the potato, and the sweet potato is a staple in European diets, right? Italian food, you better see what on some pizza? Well, not only cheese, but tomato sauce, right? The tomato is an American crop. It's not indigenous to Europe. The pumpkin, right? Native crop. And again, all of these new food sources are stimulating population growth. Not only do you have more babies being born, you have more food to go around, and not just any kind of food. High caloric food, maize, potatoes, stuff that's going to nourish Europeans. Okay? Let me show you what I'm talking about.
For centuries, Western Europeans have dreaded the dangers of the Atlantic Ocean. They called it the Green Sea of Darkness. But by the mid-1400s, new advances in navigation allowed the intrepid Portuguese to sail partway down the western coast of Africa and as far west as the Cape Verde Islands. While the Portuguese tried to discover a route eastward to the Indies, a young man from Genoa was convinced that the East Indies could be reached by sailing west.
Aristotle says that between the end of Spain and the beginning of India is a small sea, navigable in a few days.
Almost everyone else thought Christopher Columbus was wrong. But after 6 years of indecision, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel of Spain finally consented to Columbus's enterprise of the Indies. And on August 3rd, 1492, he set out with 3 ships on a journey he expected to last no more than a few weeks. More months later, his ships were still at sea. His crew, frightened of the unknown and worried that they would not be able to return, threatened to mutiny if he did not turn back. On the following day, October 11th, from the deck of the Santa Maria, Columbus sighted land. From the moment Columbus and his men set foot on the island he christened San Salvador, they began an irreversible process of biological, cultural, and material exchange that continues to this day.
The Columbian Exchange is an idea that what happened when Columbus arrived in the New World was it began a whole system of exchanges between the Old World and the New World, not only in human terms, but in biological terms.
Before 1492, life forms in the world had been developing divergently because of geographical isolation in the Old World and the New World. And then Columbus connected the two, and ever since then we've been connecting them tighter and tighter and tighter, and there's just an avalanche of life forms back and forth.
In some ways, the short-term effects were disastrous. The introduction of European diseases, for example, decimated American Indian populations. It was really a Holocaust, with in many places whole peoples dying out. And in large sections of America, it's up to 90% of the population decimated by diseases.
After the initial disease crash, the food crops of the Europeans and Africans brought with them fueled the population growth in the Americas. It's still going on. What happened in the Old World is even more spectacular and probably more important because you cannot imagine how all those people could be living in Asia, in Eurasia, in Africa without American Indian crops. Maize is the most important single crop for highland Indonesia. Potatoes have been the staple very nearly every meal in Scandinavia, right across northern Europe, Russia.
We're still living today with the results of the Columbian Exchange. And many people have said that, in fact, 1492 and the so-called discovery of America was perhaps the most important event in the history of the world, as a real sort of marker in the history of the world, and that the history of the world really should be developed to before 1492 and after 1492 for the reason of the Columbian Exchange.
All right, so let's review. What we're talking about is an exchange of people, of organisms, both plants and animals, and ideas, right? What you'll see coming across the Atlantic